Well, thanks very much. As Peter mentioned, we're going to switch gears a little bit from the previous two speakers and talk about managing buckthorn in natural areas. I see a number of colleagues and familiar faces out there. Some of this will be certainly familiar to you from your own efforts in buckthorn management. Hopefully there'll still be some pieces that are new to you as well. We're going to focus on two strategies that we've used to control large infestations in state park areas. And so what I mean by large is something in the neighborhood of about 100 acres up to thousands of acres. Before we get going, just a little bit of context on state parks. A lot of people think of it as just campgrounds, but really we manage about 235,000 acres, of which only about 5% of that is developed. The other 95% we manage for native plant communities and the associated wildlife. We have about 1,700 locations for either federal or Minnesota endangered, threatened, and special concern species that are scattered across that landscape. By statute, we are supposed to manage those lands to preserve and perpetuate natural features that existed in the area of the park prior to European settlement, as well as other significant natural, scenic, scientific, and historic features that are present. And we're also supposed to reintroduce desirable plants and animals, whatever your definition of desirable is. We utilize research to manage using the best available science, but we are certainly land managers, not researchers. You're going to hear some figures today. They're going to be about things like hours and dollars. You're not going to hear confidence intervals or p-values. As I mentioned, for today, we're going to talk about two approaches to managing large-scale buckthorn infestations in savannas and fire-dependent woodlands that reduce the impact of buckthorn in the park or the project area to really achieve two things. One is so that native species are either not or minimally impacted, and that ecological processes or natural disturbances can continue to take place. So why are we trying to manage buckthorn out of that wide variety of invasive species that we know occur on state park lands? Certainly one of the reasons is because we know there's a number of impacts that I'll get to in just a minute and that you've heard from some of the previous speakers, but also it's one that we've actually found some degree of success in managing, unlike some of the other challenges that we're dealing with. Things like garlic mustard, for example, in floodplain areas, we're really struggling primarily due to the continual reinfestation due to flood events that are happening with more frequency. In terms of the specific impacts, we've got impacts to the growth and survival of native understory plants and forest regeneration due to the shading act of buckthorn, as well as potential allelopathy. Some examples of that are plants like large-leafed aster and tall meadow rue. It alters and impacts use of wildlife in the area. Robins nesting in buckthorn have been shown to have higher nest predation rates than those in native shrubs. Ground nesters are impacted. Mammals appear to be doing some different behavior patterns in areas that are heavy with buckthorn versus not. It certainly reduces or prevents our ability to use prescribed fire in fire-dependent natural communities. As you've already heard, it serves as a host for other agricultural pests and contributes to soil erosion by shading out forest floor plants. For large-scale projects, inventory and planning are really essential to understand both the scope and scale of the effort and over time. These projects are multi-year. You're going to have changes in staffing. You need to remember from one year to the next what you did where. And so if you don't have that information, you're kind of stuck right from the get-go. We utilize the EdMaps Midwest tool that has both a smartphone and tablet app. It's available for public use to do our inventory and mapping. Some of the key questions that you're going to ask as you look at the area that you're going to work on is going to be things like, what's the distribution of buckthorn in the park or the project area? How close are those infestations to high-quality natural areas or rare species locations that you need to protect? What's the density and size of the buckthorn in the various locations you identified? What constraints are there that will impact your management options? It might be topography, it might be rare species, high quality communities, cultural research, cultural features like archaeological sites or burial mounds, historic cemeteries. And then lastly, what is the desired future condition for the area that you're working in? Is it more of a fire-dependent community, or is it more of a less fire-dependent community? So based on that inventory, now you're going to be looking at strategies, and there's probably going to be different for different parts of the infestation when you're working on a large-scale project. Certainly critical is the need to prioritize, because there will always be more buckthorn than time and money. So depending on where all those things land, one option more on the lower end of the spectrum is just trying to control those seed-bearing trees. It'll reduce and slow the spread within your project area. Maybe you can hold the line. You know where there's some heavy infestations, but there's also some areas in the unit that are relatively free of buckthorn. So you can try to work on those from the outside in toward the epicenter, because you know that epicenter is going to take lots of time and effort, and as long as you can kind of keep that barrier on the outside, you're going to help reduce that spread. Maybe you know of a number of high-quality natural areas or rare species in your unit, so you can focus your efforts on managing the buckthorn in and around those sites. And oftentimes it's going to be a multi-focus when you're working on a large-scale infestation, because you're going to have these things scattered throughout your property. So you might be applying all of these tactics either sequentially or concurrently. And they're sort of all considered phases of an overall project. And certainly really critical is, before you jump into this, make sure that you've got plans for long-term management. Otherwise, it's really going to be difficult to reach your objectives, and it can certainly feel like you're going backwards. For large-scale projects, we typically employ multiple control methods. Among chemical options, we use basal bark, cut stump, and foliar, both spot and boom applications. In terms of non-chemical, as Joe mentioned at the beginning, there's options with pulling using weed wrenches and other tools, propane torches, machinery, livestock, prescribed burning. Certainly some are better suited than others when we're attempting to do large-scale work. I'll zip through these fairly quickly, but just to give you some advantages and disadvantages around these different methods. Basal bark, when you're applying an herbicide, typically to the lower 12 inches of the stem, it's kind of moderate in effort in terms of labor hours per acre. It's physically less demanding. You might have to carry around a backpack sprayer, but it's not like carrying other heavy equipment. And also, you don't necessarily have to move anything, because the stems are going to stay in place. So you're not worried about having to move that and pile it. It's very effective at killing the stem and root reserves. In terms of the disadvantages, the cost per acre can be fairly high, and that's largely due to the herbicide cost, which is about half of the total cost of this type of management application. You do have high rates of herbicide use, and as has been mentioned earlier, in some cases, some locations, that can be a concern. If you've got a pretty dense area and you treat all this buckthorn and it dies, you've now increased the fuel in that area, so the potential for doing either prescribed burn or wildfire, there's changes if you've got that higher density of fuel. And you do need to have stems that are somewhere in between like 1 to 2 inches to really be effective. You get below that, it's pretty hard to use this method. Cut stump is one that you see very typically. It's a moderate cost per acre, and the piling of the material, so actually moving the material after you cut it and put it somewhere, is about 50% of the cost. So if you don't have to pile it, that's great. You get a real instant reward, because when you do clean up an area, it looks fantastic. There's all this buckthorn in there, and then you cut it all down, and if you do go pile it somewhere, it looks fantastic. There's a very low rate of respout as long as you've done good application methods. It works well on larger diameter stems. On the disadvantage side, it's pretty labor intensive. You got to haul around chainsaws, brush saws. The follow-up burn that you do can scorch, burn native species, or if you're piling stuff, you can sort of sterilize the soil underneath those burns, so you need to be thinking about that. more labor intensive if you're piling the material. And so even though it looks really good when you get that acre done, it takes quite a while to get that acre done. So you have kind of a slow rate of progress. Using a machine and equipment, similar to like a hydro axe, you get the lowest effort in terms of the labor hours per acre. It is relatively low cost. One of the things that we've certainly found in using both our own staff and CCM crews is machines don't get tired. So you can do large acres and not have everybody just frustrated that they've been doing this for 2 weeks straight. And in terms of the follow-up fire or even wildfire concerns, the plant material gets shredded down, and so you don't have piles of material sitting around. Disadvantages, I should have said this a little bit differently. One of the first times we tried this, we actually tried to do cut stump treatment following, and you really can't find them because the material's shredded all over the place. So you're really best to just wait till you get sprouting in the spring, and then you can see the little seedlings, and then you can do a foliar treatment. It is limited by topography and site conditions. If it's hilly, it's steep slopes, you're not going to be able to use this. If it's a sensitive area, you want to be careful. It's really hard on the soils unless you're doing this in the winter time with frozen ground. And I know the times that we've used this, there have been winters where we never got frozen ground conditions, so we just had to scrap the project and wait for the next year. And sometimes that can be difficult because the funding that you have might run out. So that's a challenge. And then you certainly, just because of the scale of the machine and its ability to turn, you're going to end up with some non-target vegetation impacts. Prescribed fire is certainly one of our lowest cost options. It doesn't disturb the soil. It will kill the seedlings and suppress above ground parts, suitable for large scale efforts. On the disadvantaged side, and certainly requires specially qualified personnel and equipment. It does stimulate seed germination, which can sort of be a good or bad thing if you're trying to exhaust the seed bank. It's a way to stimulate some of that seed that's in there. It absolutely has to be used in combination with other methods. It's not going to work well just on its own. And it requires multiple burns. This isn't something where you can just go in and utilize it one time or just a couple times. And there's a handful of other things that are going on that we use very intermittently. Livestock, goats, you may have seen some of the recent articles. There was one just last month in the paper about using goats. Can work in settings where your native plant community has already been fairly heavily impacted. In our experience, we've tried it and found they were pretty non-selective in what they were eating. So if you have a high quality community, you might be losing some of the good stuff that you want at the same time. Pulling certainly doesn't lend itself to large scale efforts unless you've got something like maybe you've got a gung-ho big volunteer group that wants to come. Then you can really do a lot with those folks. You do need to be careful because the soil disturbance can be pretty significant. And then another tool that we've used periodically, propane torch. It's effective on stems that are less than 2 inches diameter. Again, can be alternative if you're working in areas where herbicide application is a concern. So I want to hit on these two large-scale projects. Our first one here is at Rice Lake State Park. It's in Steele and Dodge counties in southeast Minnesota. It was a 78-acre project. It was done over about 6 years. The existing native plant community was a burrow-dominated woodland, had some wet swales with ash and sedges in it, ephemeral pools, and then some remnant prairie and openings around the outside. Our desired future condition was a dry mesic oak aspen forest. When we looked at the public land survey records, they described the area as being thickets and oak grubs, so we knew it was a fire-dependent area. The historic return interval for fire was about 18 years. In terms of the natural and cultural resource considerations, we did have relatively flat topography. We had good access. There were no rare natural features or cultural resources that had been documented on the site, but we did know there was a high potential for cultural resources because of the location of the site immediately adjacent to the lake. So I'm actually going to hit the fourth bullet first. This was a place where we actually did implement 3 different treatments specifically to compare costs and effectiveness under similar site conditions. And so we did about 6.5 acres of basal bark treatment, about 22 acres of cut stump and herbicide application, and then close to 50 acres using a machine mechanical work. That was done again on frozen ground conditions to avoid impacts to the soil, ground vegetation, and potential cultural resources. So here's what it looked like when we got done, and these are 02 and 03 costs. I'll let you use your own inflation calculator to figure out what those would be today. Basal bark had about 30 to 50 labor hours per acre. The cost was somewhere between just under $1,000 to just under $2,000 per acre. We had high buckthorn mortality, limited resprouting, and significant canopy opening. The two pictures to the far left of the screen is one of the areas that we worked. The picture on the right is the one that we worked in. The one on the left is not. That was taken on the same day, 4 months after treatment had been done. Then cut stump, just about 100 acres up, or I'm sorry, about 100 hours up to 200 hours per acre, roughly $650 to almost $1,400 per acre. Again, we had low resprouting, dramatic canopy opening, and difficulties here, so I won't try to point it out, but we had excellent response from the ground vegetation. That's that central picture on the bottom. And then lastly, that machine. When we were using just the machine, it was about an hour per acre and about $200. Shred stems, it's fast and efficient, but you really do have to have follow-up. So if when we were using herbicide application to follow up, and this ended up kind of being a combination of some cut stump and foliar, then the hours increased to about 11 to 24, cost about $370 to $450, and then again, as I know, prescribed fire was one of our follow-ups for the long-term management. Our second project area was at Maplewood State Park up in kind of west central. Project area was 7,300 acres, so about 10 times the size of the Rice Lake project. Went from 2003 to 06. It was primarily a central mesic hardwood forest, but it does have also within the park old fields, prairie restorations, and water bodies. Pre-European settlement, it was pretty similar hardwood forest with oak openings and barrens. Desired future conditions was very similar to the type that's there now. It was just simply with getting rid of a lot of the buckthorn that was there. And the historic return interval for fire is much longer, but that was actually just for the mesic hardwood communities. Here we did have 9 known archaeological sites. We had a high potential for cultural resources around the many water bodies that are in the park, and then a couple species of special concern, birds, red-shouldered hawks, and cerulean warblers. So this one, because of the topography and labor force, some other options, we weren't able to use machinery. We used staff and CCM crews to help us with this. After we got done with the mapping, we gridded out the park so that we would ensure that we could treat all the infestations and then be able to find them again for follow-up. So our basic treatment methods were cut stump using brush saws and chainsaws, and then followed by prescribed burning. In 03, we covered about 890 acres. In 04 and 05, about 1,700 acres each year. And then in 06, almost 3,000 acres that were checked and or managed. So what did we get for a result there? Buckthorn was controlled on all areas of the park in which we had documented it occurring, so that's 7,300 acres. At the time we were finished, there were no seed-bearing individuals known to remain in the park. You'll see the picture over on the left. There are some folks celebrating with some big giant buckthorn that they yanked out of the ground. We continue to use prescribed burning to manage the remaining seedlings and saplings. When you spread this over the whole park, you get a pretty low average of about $12 per acre. Still, the project was close to $90,000. But the cost is so dependent on the density and the size of the buckthorn. We also did similar work at Glacial Lakes and Buffalo River State Parks. We had 50 acres that was relatively dense, and that cost us $240 an acre for a total of $12,000. We also did another project there with dense buckthorn that cost us $500 per acre. So it's just really really dependent on those things. And so just to wrap up here, some sort of key points around large-scale buckthorn management. We certainly feel that you can achieve success as long as you define it as functioning ecological processes and minimal impact to natural communities, not buckthorn eradication. It requires a very long time commitment. 15 years is not out of the realm when you're thinking about getting to that point of a maintenance phase. You need to have inventory and planning. You want to make sure that you're going to protect those rare natural and cultural resources. You certainly don't want to irreparably harm those things in the process of doing buckthorn management, which the reason you're doing that is to help benefit these kind of species. Your strategies and control methods are going to depend on your inventory results, current and future dollars, rare natural cultural features that are present, your available labor, and so forth. It's a good idea, if you haven't been doing a lot of this, to set realistic goals and objectives, succeed in a small area, go from there. Resprouts and seedlings are going to need to be addressed repeatedly regardless of the method, and prescribed for burning is critical to long-term success in fire-dependent communities. Many thanks to folks that are colleagues with me, Sean Fritcher and Cindy Luth, who provided a lot of the project details. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing with us all your hard work and this morning's talk as well. We have time for a couple of questions.
When you're doing both the basal treatment and the cut stump, were there a formulation of a chemical or a type of chemical that worked better than others that you noticed?
We used two different, I wouldn't say it was necessary, we used two different, we used a 10% and a 30% compared to oil, 70% and 90%, with the 10% in the basal bark and the 30% on the cut stump.
Was that like we're using like a Roundup or a Garland type product?
We're using the Garland. Yeah. Yep.
Any other questions? Everyone ready to do this at home now? Okay. Oh, here's a question. Dave.
Oh, hi, Dave.
Ed, on a landscape scale, we have almost 17 million acres of forest in Minnesota, and from one of the maps we saw earlier, virtually all of it's got the small to a very large amount of buckthorn in it. So one of the challenges we face is, half of our forest is privately owned, and a lot of the private landowners is just overwhelming. The costs per acre, the labor involved, the potential for unintended side effects. Do you have any suggestions vis-a-vis private forest landowners, how they approach this, beyond what you said in your last slide?
Yeah. Not really. I think it's, it costs money to do it. And so there's got to be some incentives there. When I worked out in Vermont, there was some incentive programs that private forest landowners could use to help manage their forest, and then they they generated some income from the harvest that they could use. I guess I would say broadly some of the things to think about is because it's all over. We're not trying to eradicate it. So I think that you really want to think about what are the particular values that you want to protect on that piece of land, and I would focus there. And not necessarily try to think about the big picture, because I think that's very challenging.
Thank you.
Did you ever use glyphosate instead of Garland?
I haven't. Mark or John? Go ahead, John.
For cut stump, it works. Basal bark, no.
Yeah.
But for cut stump, concentrated glyphosate will work.
Yeah.
What percent? What percent?
Normally 15 to 20.
Yeah.
So 5 or 10 won't work?
5 won't, 10 might.
Right.
Depends on the time of year.
Yeah.
There's a lot of variations on there, but it only has to be, the other problem is only the cut stump.
Dump.
It doesn't have to be spread around.
No.
But normally, when I tell people if you can buy the homeowner's concentrate, use that straight.
Right. Yep.
that's about, I think, 12 or 15%.
Yeah.
So the Roundup you buy at Home Depot.
Yep, just buy it, use that right out of the bottle. Yep.
Question?
Yeah. What percent of your like actual managed land are you like still managing for buckthorn, like spraying resprouts from the like 7,300 acres? Do you think?
Out of, okay.
Yeah, not the whole state.
Yeah. No, I say out of our whole system. I probably can't give you a figure on that. I know that, like, right now, you know, it's roughly 10 years after some of those big efforts. Because we know that birds are still dropping, you know, seeds and there's new plants starting, and certainly when you're doing these very large-scale infestations, even though you think you got everything, you didn't always get everything. And so we've had some come back. And so we are, I mean, every year in the program I administer, about 30% of our effort goes toward invasive species. And I can't tell you what percentage of that is buckthorn, but yeah, we're definitely going back and treating, and I probably could have described that long term. That it's sort of, you are in it for the long haul, as in this will always, if it's important for you to manage buckthorn on the lands that you're responsible for, even when you go through these big efforts, you're probably going to be able to reduce your cost per acre and so forth, but you're always going to be doing it.
Yeah, I was just curious if you did any winter treatments, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, actually a lot of that's
I might have
like
missed it.
that Rice Lake project, that was mostly done in the winter, where we used, like our cut stump and so forth, we used penetrating oil and the winter garland. And then a lot of the stuff we did at Maplewood was done in the fall. Yes.
Did we get your presentation anywhere?
Well,
If you're willing to have it posted, we'll make it available to people. And we'll do that for all of the talks if the speakers are okay with that. Let's thank Ed again for his talk.